As we have been reporting, Aaron Lewis has had an extensive criminal history, and that included a year-and-a-half in an Arkansas prison. He is currently on parole.
In part one of a three-part series, KARK Petrimoulx begins looking deeper into the secrets of state prisons and parole system and the secrets they hold. He's joining us now in the studio with more on this. And Drew, what'd you find out?
Well, in Arkansas, much of what happens behind the walls of prisons is never known by the public. Prison officials say the secrecy is needed to keep prisons secure. But we found victims and family members frustrated, and one lawmaker pushing for changes, saying the secrecy is a danger to the public. Tammy Harper has stacks upon stacks of paperwork relating to the case. Her crusade starting 12 years ago when her world came crashing down.
She just told me that she needed to talk to me.
Harper's daughter, Brittany Humphrey, just a third grader.
She just said, "Mama, Mr. Floss has been touching me." When she said that, I just grabbed her and fell to the floor with her and just cried with her.
Brian Floss, a former teacher at Wallace Elementary in Fordyce, was sentenced to 15 years behind bars in 2003. It wasn't long before Floss was eligible for parole, but every year that his case goes before the parole board, Tammy is there to read a letter from her daughter.
I just begged for him not to let him out.
The letters talk about the fear of Floss being released, but as these victims fight to keep a convicted predator locked up, there's a lot they don't know.
I tried to find out things, but I couldn't find out nothing.
The Arkansas Department of Corrections says crimes committed behind bars are investigated by state police. ADC says there were 58 investigations from January 1st to August 30th of this year.
It's an incomplete picture.
State Senator David Sanders says state police investigations only shed light on a fraction of the trouble that goes on behind bars. Sanders says many crimes and other prison policy infractions are investigated internally, those records not available to the public.
We need transparency in the state of Arkansas with regard to the complete public record of criminal files. We don't have it, and we're paying the price because of that.
Sanders says it keeps lawmakers, the media, the public, and crime victims in the dark about how convicts behave in prison.
So unfair. So unfair.
Can you understand the frustration that some might have?
I can understand the concern that people might have in wanting to know everything that someone has done, but there are also issues that we have to consider as far as safety and security of our prison go.
But Sanders says states like Arizona, Kansas, Florida, and North Carolina provide the public with more complete pictures of how prisoners behave.
He's affected my life from the day that it happened and for the rest of my life.
Brittany Humphrey uses what happened to her as motivation to help others living the same nightmare. She competes in pageants, recently finishing in the top 10 for Miss Arkansas, and speaks openly about the abuse she faced as a child.
And so within the last year, I decided it's time to go before the parole board myself, and then this year I went on my own.
This year, for the first time, she read her letter in person. Floss was denied parole again, but count her among those calling for the public to know more about what happens behind prison walls.
It's not going to completely ease the pain, but I think that we should be able to know those things.
Now, ADC officials assured us that while the public doesn't have access to the disciplinary records of prisoners, the parole board does, and it has ultimate say over whether an inmate is granted parole. But we found examples of inmates committing serious violations behind bars and still being put back out on the streets only to commit crimes again. KARK reporter Marci Manley has that in part 2 of the story tomorrow night.
Lewis was out on parole for the past year. He now faces, as mentioned, a capital murder charge for Beverly Carter's death.
Lewis, though, he is not the only parolee to be accused of committing a violent crime. Just last night, we highlighted the information the public doesn't get to know about the Department of Correction prisoners and those currently on parole.
In part 2 of this three-part special series, Marci Manley taking a look at the parole board, which does have access to that information, and why one lawmaker believes the board's decisions to release certain prisoners have cost people their lives. Marci.
Bob, Ashley, a prisoner's behavior behind bars, as we have highlighted, is shielded from the public, victims' families, and even lawmakers. But the parole board, as you said, has access to that information when considering whether a prisoner should be released on parole. One lawmaker saying he believes those shielded files should have been a red flag on the release of at least 2 parolees with multiple felony convictions now facing murder charges.
Waiting for bed space to come available.
Wes Bradford has been prosecuting criminals for nearly 2 decades.
So theoretically, they could do it even more often.
And now he's facing one defendant twice in about 6 years.
We know we're going to be prosecuting repeat offenders.
Bradford sent Donald C. Biles to prison in 2008 for theft. An extensive criminal history landed Biles a 30-year sentence, but he was paroled after serving 5 years.
The fact that he has a criminal history does make it frustrating because you want to feel like somehow the system is correcting a problem.
Now, Biles is back behind prison walls, charged with capital murder. He's accused of robbing Ozark Emporium at gunpoint in July, killing 75-year-old store owner Lorraine Cart in the process.
If he had still been in prison, this poor lady would not be dead and her family would not be having to worry about this.
According to State Senator David Sanders, Biles not the only case like this. He points to Will Johnston, accused of capital murder and attempted capital murder in a Pine Bluff shooting in July.
When he was let out on parole, he murdered, he killed. He killed in cold blood.
Johnston paroled in May 2014 after serving a year in prison following a previous parole revocation on a burglary and drug conviction. Sanders says he never followed up with parole officers.
These 2 individuals were already headed down the wrong way.
The parole board, chaired by John Feltz, decides which prisoners are released and which are kept behind bars when the Department of Correction determines an inmate is eligible.
You can always look back and say, well, that person shouldn't have been released.
According to Feltz, Biles and Johnston's convictions were for nonviolent crimes, and the board has to weigh its options when considering more than 1,000 cases a month.
Both of them would have ultimately been returned back. Neither was doing a life sentence.
But Sanders saying convictions aren't the complete picture because of disciplinary sanctions behind bars. He adds Biles was disciplined for sexual assault against another inmate.
This is a person who should have never been let out on parole.
And Johnston punished for assault and organizing a hate group among other prison sanctions.
Both Will Johnston and Donald Biles, there were major red flags with their disciplinary history.
Feltz tells us disciplinary sanctions are part of the parole board's review, along with each member interviewing inmates and making recommendations to the board on their release. But he adds parole case files contain additional information like victim statements, law enforcement input, and factors like age, criminal history, and amount of time served all weigh in, particularly in cases like Biles.
He did have a prior criminal history. That's true. But the fact of the matter is, if we use that same logic, we would have 3,500 people backed up in the county jails rather than 2,100 people backed up in the county jails.
If information on Donald Biles and Will Johnston had been made public, and numerous other inmates who have ultimately been paroled, I don't think that the parole board would be so apt to grant parole.
It may be the best system out there, but it's not perfect. But we do everything we can for our victims.
And that means putting bad guys behind bars. However often they may come back across Wes Bradford's desk. Feltz added that while those parolees who commit crimes make headlines, there are hundreds of parolees abiding and reacclimating in society. Sanders saying that would be more apparent to the public if all of these records, including parole board case files, were open. In part 3 of this special report tomorrow night, Drew Petrimoulx and I take a look at what specific changes Sanders suggests and why he believes it might make Arkansas communities safer.
Over the last 2 days, we've been looking into the secrets of the Arkansas prison and parole systems.
We told you about victims and their families' frustration, feeling that they're being kept in the dark about what goes on behind prison walls. You also heard from a prosecutor on the parole system's revolving door. He says keeps putting dangerous criminals back out on the streets to mix and mingle with the rest of us.
And tonight we talk solutions. One state lawmaker is proposing sweeping changes he says will end the secrecy and hold the system accountable. We have team coverage on this story, first from KARK's Drew Petrimoulx.
Well, Arkansas is what's known as a closed record state. Some would say nowhere is that more evident than in the prison system, where behavioral records of inmates are kept from public view. One lawmaker says that ends up putting the public in danger. Tonight, for the first time, he offers up his solution.
It's all copies of everything that I had to work for.
Tammy Harper has endless stacks of papers documenting her daughter's case. Every year, when the man accused of sexually assaulting then 8-year-old Brittany Humphrey goes before the parole board, Harper is there begging against his release.
They sentenced him to prison for 15 years.
But Harper and her daughter are missing what they believe is crucial information, a complete picture of how Brian Floss is behaving behind bars.
I mean, there's a problem there. I think it needs changed.
Internal prison investigations into inmate behavior are not public record. State Senator David Sanders says that clouds decisions on which inmates should be paroled and puts the public in danger.
If, in fact, we're trying to keep violent offenders behind bars, I think the best indication of what a person would do in public is what they do when they're incarcerated.
In the coming legislative session, Sanders says he'll introduce the Public Safety Transparency Act. Among other things, it would establish a publicly accessible database that includes inmate and parolee supervision and disciplinary records.
The decades-old practice of shielding that information, what you do behind the walls of a prison and how you comply with supervision, that is protected. That is privileged information. That can't continue to happen.
But ADC says releasing the information would put prison security at risk.
When you have confidential witness statements from other inmates or statements involving staff, if those investigative type files dealing with those specific issues were to be public, then inmate families or associates of inmates can get a hold of that information, provide it to the inmate, and then it provides a reason and documentation sort of for these types of people who might want to do so to retaliate against people who might have provided information that got them in trouble.
All they are excuses. They're not good reasons. In fact, to err on the side of transparency is to err on the side of public safety.
Sanders says states like Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, and Kansas already make information available with no signs of negative effects. Brittany Humphrey turned out all right. She was top 10 in this year's Miss Arkansas pageant. She's studying social work at Henderson State, aiming to help kids facing the same abuse she did.
Brittany's platform is Break the Silence, preventing child sexual abuse.
Someone could be watching and we could change their life.
She hopes the new legislation will help make the next victim's recovery a little easier. When we spoke with ADC about the proposed legislation, the agency spokeswoman said it would be willing to consider changes but hopes to play an important role in any discussions. But the Public Safety Transparency Act would reach much further than prison walls. For more, here's Marci Manley.
David Sanders doesn't just want to open records from prison to the public. He wants all files that support an inmate's release disclosed by the parole board. And he has some ideas about how appointees to the board are selected as well.
Mama, Mr. Floss has been doing bad things to me.
Victim testimony, part of the process for the parole board when deciding who to keep behind bars and who to release.
It is devastating for us.
Case files, including risk assessments, prison disciplinary records, and inmate hearings also help form that decision, but can be kept from the public by law.
Just about everything that they do is shielded from public view, and that has to stop.
State Senator David Sanders wants to see all parole board files out in the open.
Deliberations should be recorded. I think we should know who interviews, which members interviews particular individuals.
As cases of parolees accused of violent crimes continue to hit headlines.
We can look at numerous cases going back over the years, in fact, where they have let individuals out who have gone on to do great harm.
Parole Board Chair John Feltz saying the board will comply with what the legislature deems necessary, but adds challenges in parole exist regardless of the status of records.
Every person that the parole board sees and considers for parole is a convicted felon. They are all capable of going out and committing a heinous crime.
Sanders saying appointments to the parole board also need to come with specific qualifications beyond minimums set out in law.
We have a parole board, an appointed parole board, where there aren't any real qualifications in terms of certification.
Feltz answering he understands the frustration crime can cause.
Are we perfect? No. But again, no matter who you would put on the board, no matter what kind of risk assessment, you're always going to have some of those folks that are going to shock you when they get out.
But he believes challenges in parole, because of the nature of crime, are bigger than who fills the seats. Ultimately, the governor makes appointments to the parole board. While members must have a bachelor's degree and experience in broad criminal justice-related fields, Sanders would like to see specific seats dedicated to specific types of experience. Back to you.
Marci, thanks. We have learned a lot in this entire series. If you want to find out more, just go to arkansasmatters.com. You can see the full series there on the secrets of the Arkansas parole system.